Hello friends, I am Samir Babu from the Department of Education, University of Kerala. Today I would like to discuss some significant concerns in research, that is hypothesizing. As we all know, hypothesis is one of the significant component in quantitative research. When we do a research in education, psychology, commerce, management or any other aspects of social relevance, we have to hypothesize for the first time. What is actually hypothesis? Hypothesis is a tentative generalization. We can consider it as a studied guess about the result of your study. If I have a study, for example, I am having a study on relationship between quality of work life and emotional balance of working women. If I have this problem in my mind or in my research, so what I have to do, I have to look into what are the significant results of the previous studies. Accordingly, I have to hypothesize what will be the possible results of my study. So here the previous studies as well as the experience will work as one of the significant component in identifying some of the key concern in your result. It is not exactly your research, as you know, it is a tentative generalization or tentative assumption regarding the result of your study. Now come to hypothesizing. How do we hypothesize? Yes, sometimes students have or research scholars have a confusion regarding how do we hypothesize. It is a general trend among some of the researchers that they sometimes write the hypothesis in null form. This is actually not recommendable. Hypothesizing in null form is not recommendable. Those who don't know the exact aspects of hypothesis, they generally go for hypothesizing in null form. Let me explain three major components of hypothesizing. Otherwise, I can tell that there are three major types of hypothesis. One is directional hypothesis. What is directional hypothesis? For example, I am having a problem on quality of work life and emotional balance of working women. Here, my study aims at identifying the significant relationship between quality of work life and emotional balance of working women. So, what I can do, whether I can hypothesize whether there is a chance of positive relationship or there is a chance of negative relationship. This is the only possibility of hypothesis for me. Sometimes I may not have clarity regarding whether it will be a positive hypothesis or it will be a negative hypothesis. In the sense, there is a negative relationship or there is a positive relationship. There are two ways of possibilities for me. In this example, I have mentioned two chances of hypothesis. One is there is a positive relationship between quality of work life and emotional balance of working women. The second is there is a negative relationship between quality of work life and emotional balance of working women. Here what you have observed, the direction of the hypothesizing is very clear. Either I have mentioned positively related or negatively related. This way we can call it as directional hypothesis. The direction is very clear. I can give you another example. When we compare in quantitative research, generally we have comparison kind of objectives. For example, whether boys and girls differ in their language proficiency. So here my hypothesis, chances of hypothesizing is 1. Boys perform better than girls. Otherwise, boys have better language proficiency than girls of secondary schools. Similarly, the opposite is also possible. Here what I mentioned is boys are performing better or girls are having high proficiency in language. In this case, it is very clear the direction, it is very clear the comparison that boys perform better, otherwise girls perform better. This kind of hypothesis is known as directional hypothesis. That is, the direction of the hypothesizing is very clear. How do we know this kind of hypothesizing? Simply, can we write it simply as a directional hypothesis? No, it is not possible. That is why we are going for review of related literature. When we review the significant studies from the field, for example, if I take the quality of work life and emotional balance of working women, I will look into the studies already carried out in this direction. How many studies have carried out that looks into the relationship between quality of work life and emotional balance in general as well as in specific among working women across the globe. So, I will list out how many studies have mentioned positive relationship, how many studies have mentioned negative relationship among these two variables. So, that is actually the concern of the researcher before hypothesizing. So, directional hypothesis is when you give a clear direction of the relationship or difference in your hypothesis, that is known as directional hypothesis. Come to the other form of hypothesis, that is non-directional hypothesis. What is non-directional hypothesis? When I mention the hypothesis, say for example, there is a relationship between quality of work life and emotional balance. I do not have a clarity what kind of relationship it is. Whether it is negative, positive, I do not have a clarity, because when I go through some of the related studies, I got some of the studies having positive relationship, some of the studies report negative relationship. I got confused as a researcher. In this case, I generally go for non-directional hypothesis. I am not going to specify which is the direction, whether there is a positive relationship, whether there is a negative relationship, that I do not know exactly. From the studies, I do not have a clarity. Accordingly, I fix it as non-directional. Then I can term it as there is a relationship between the variable x and y. In this case, the variable work life, quality of work life and emotional balance of working women. There is a relationship. When it comes to the difference, for example, rural and urban students differ significantly in their social competence. Boys and girls differ significantly in their language proficiency. I did not mention who is performing better. In the earlier example, I mentioned that boys perform better than girls. Boys are superior to girls in their proficiency. This was the directional hypothesis. When it comes to non-directional, the researcher simply states that there is a significant relationship or there is a significant difference between x and y, that is x and y, this is the classificatory variables that I am having in terms of certain other component. Let me give another example. Boys and girls differ significantly in their mathematics achievement. So, mathematics achievement, that is the base. Accordingly, we are mentioning whether boys and girls differ significantly or not. Clear? Now, we are going to have another hypothesis, that is null hypothesis. What is actually null hypothesis? There are lots of confusions among researchers regarding null hypothesis. When we go through certain projects, certain dissertations and theses, we come across many students just simply write null hypothesis as their major hypothesis. The hypothesis that is mentioned in null form is used only during the testing of hypothesis. For example, I have a directional hypothesis or I have a non-directional hypothesis. Then, when you have a hypothesis in your quantitative research, definitely you have to test in terms of certain statistical measures. That is one of the requirements. When you have a hypothesis, you have to test it, you have to prove it or disprove it. So, in that case, we are changing the hypothesis into null form. For example, I have mentioned a directional hypothesis. There is a positive relationship between quality of work life and emotional balance of working women. How can I make it null hypothesis? Simply, there is no significant relationship between quality of work life and emotional balance of working women. If it is a non-directional hypothesis, there is a relationship between quality of work life and emotional balance of working women. That can also be changed into there is no significant relationship between quality of work life and emotional balance of working women. If it is the classificatory variable and the comparison based hypothesis, For example, boys and girls differ in their English language proficiency. So my hypothesis will be there is a difference between boys and girls in their English language proficiency if it is non-directional. If it is directional hypothesis, I have seen that many of the studies report that girls have more language competency. Then I can write that girls perform better than boys in their language proficiency test. So that will be my hypothesis. In both the cases, I can write null hypothesis as there is no significant difference between boys and girls in their language proficiency in English. Clear? So this will be used, that is the null hypothesis will be used when we are going to test the hypothesis. This will be used when we are going to test the hypothesis in terms of statistical measures. Then again it comes another significant issue. How do we write the tenability of hypothesis? There is again confusion among students, among research scholars and researchers. So here I can tell you a clarity regarding that. With my limited reading, I have seen that, I have read and I have heard from some of the experts that when we are writing the hypothesis and testing the hypothesis, on the first stage you have to write your hypothesis as such. Again you have to write the null form of the hypothesis. Then the result you are mentioning over there. The result, what is your result? After your study, when you carried out your study and when you test the hypothesis as one of the final stages of your research project, you can mention the tenability of hypothesis. Then you, as such, you mention whether there is a possibility of retaining hypothesis or rejecting the hypothesis. So you have to mention the result of your study. Then at the end, you have to mention whether you substantiate your hypothesis or not. Here the general format of writing is that you are deciding, your decision will be based on the null hypothesis and not based on your alternate hypothesis. That is, whatever the hypothesis you have mentioned, you have written on your major hypothesis segment, that is known as alternate hypothesis. It may be either directional or non-directional. So you are not supposed to judge based on the alternate hypothesis. What you are going to do? You are going to write based on your result whether the null hypothesis is rejected or failed to reject. Generally we mention rejected or failed to reject. There is no standard use of accept the null hypothesis. Always we use, whenever you check the textbooks of statistics, the speakers of statistics, they always mention that there is no specific terminology of accepting the hypothesis, especially the accepting the null hypothesis. So at the end, what we are going to do? We reject the null hypothesis when the result is significant, or we fail to reject the hypothesis when the result is not significant. So as a whole, I discussed here three major concepts of hypothesis: directional hypothesis, non-directional hypothesis and null hypothesis. One more aspect I have to add here, that is the selection of statistics in terms of the hypothesizing. So we have two major hypotheses in research: directional hypothesis and non-directional hypothesis. When your hypothesis and the style of writing is directional in nature, definitely you have to go for one-tail test. One-tail test of significance. When you go for statistics, you have to use one-tail test of significance. That your rejection area will be on the one hand of the normal curve, on the one end of your normal curve. If you are talking about non-directional hypothesis, the statistical calculations will be, test of significance will be two-tail test of significance. This is all about my presentations today. Thank you so much.